In the hush of a brownstone where orchid petals never lie, a so-called cursed pearl set off a chain of fear, deception, and murder. Behind every polished surface was a crack, and beneath each superstition, something far more dangerous. A silent killer hid in plain sight, using myth as their mask, until reason struck like a match in the dark. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. It was the kind of Tuesday that made you question your life choices, particularly the one about working for a man who considered leaving his chair an affront to civilization. I was parked in the red armchair in Wolfe's office, thumbing through the latest edition of American Collector, mostly for the pictures of overpriced junk disguised as rare treasure. The center spread was devoted to gemstones. There was a black pearl the size of a robin's egg captioned "The Widow's Drop," rare black Tahitian, $120,000. I whistled low. Across the hall, Fritz was muttering like a priest over a cracked chalice. The muttering got louder, then more French. That meant trouble. "You call this pâté, Mr. Goodwin?" he demanded, appearing in the office doorway with a silver tray and a look that could curdle wine. "I don't recall calling it anything, Fritz, but if we're voting, I'd say it's more honest than some of Wolfe's opinions on democracy." He sniffed and returned to his kitchen, no doubt to weep over duck liver and culinary betrayal. Wolfe, meanwhile, was somewhere upstairs in the orchid room, pretending the world didn't exist and doing a fine job of it. I had nothing on my plate, not a case, not a caller, not even a crossword. I was about to start ranking the gemstones by homicide potential when the doorbell rang. Not a buzz, a full, deliberate ring. I got up, straightened my tie, out of sheer instinct, and opened the door. And there she was. She was tall, willowy, and dressed like the ghost of Fifth Avenue. A black silk coat fell to her ankles, and a veil concealed everything above the lips, though the red lipstick was vivid enough to tell you she wasn't dead. Yet, her gloved hands clutched a rectangular leather case against her chest like a last will and testament. Something about her made you want to lower your voice, even if you were me. "Miss," I asked. "Van Orton," she said, the voice soft but steady. "Lucinda Van Orton. I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately." Now, when people come asking for Nero Wolfe unannounced, it's usually because they either want something too fast or too foolish. I wasn't yet sure which category she belonged in, but the tremor in her fingers said she believed it was life and death, or maybe something worse. "Come in," I said. "Let's introduce you to the world's most sedentary genius." She stepped inside. Even the rug seemed to hush around her. I led her into the office and gestured to the red chair recently vacated by yours truly. "Mr. Wolfe will be down shortly," I lied. Wolfe never came down shortly. "I'll wait," she said, sitting rigid as a lamppost. "I need his help. Someone is going to kill me." That got my attention. Before I could probe, the floorboard creaked upstairs. Either Wolfe had smelled money, or the woman's perfume had hit the right nerve. Either way, something told me this wasn't going to be one of our quiet weeks. Wolfe entered 10 minutes later, as I'd predicted, reluctantly, slowly, and with all the grace of a man approaching a duel with a soup spoon. He took one look at Lucinda Van Orton, lifted a brow, and made a quarter turn toward his desk. "I am Nero Wolfe," he said. "You may speak." Lucinda did. What followed was the kind of tale that belongs in thunderstorm novels and ghost stories told after brandy. She had recently inherited an item of considerable notoriety, a rare black pearl known in certain upper-crust whisperings as the mourner's eye.
Legend said it came from the wreckage of a 17th-century Dutch galleon sunk off Mauritius, claimed later by a French corsair whose crew died one by one before reaching port. Since then, it had passed through 4 families, 3 of which experienced scandal, suicide, or sudden ruin. Lucinda didn't believe in curses, she assured us, but her fiancé had drowned 3 weeks ago after proposing with the ring that held the pearl. A week later, her family's valet collapsed dead at the breakfast table. Diagnosis: undetermined cardiac event. And now, her nights were filled with footsteps she didn't recognize and warnings she hadn't asked for. Last night, someone, or something, had left a note on her pillow that read, "The eye sees through you." She opened the leather case. Inside was the pearl ring, gleaming like midnight caught in a teardrop. Wolfe, to his credit, didn't roll his eyes. He folded his hands, frowned mildly, and said, "Pfui." Wolfe didn't lean in. He didn't blink. He didn't even adjust his vest, which was what passed for dramatic reaction in his repertoire. He simply stared at the pearl for a moment, as though it were a spoiled soufflé Fritz had dared to serve, then looked up at Lucinda. "Miss Van Orton," he said, "you are not a credulous child, nor, I gather, a woman inclined toward theatre. Yet you stand in my office repeating fairy tales with the trembling sincerity of a spiritualist." Lucinda's knuckles whitened on the edge of the leather case. "I'm not imagining the deaths." "No, but you are imagining their meaning." He settled deeper into his chair. "Curses, madam, are the confection of primitive minds attempting to make sense of misfortune. They are irrational, unprovable, and, most damningly, commonplace." "You don't believe this is dangerous?" she asked. "I believe superstition is more virulent than most diseases." He reached for a book on his side table, Herodotus in translation. That was his version of discussion over. I cleared my throat and crossed my arms, which is my standard move when I want Wolfe to know I'm about to be annoying. "I don't know, boss," I said, "but if a guy drowns with a cursed pearl in his pocket and a butler croaks over coffee, maybe it's worth more than a lecture from the science club." Wolfe didn't lift his eyes from the page. "She has offered no evidence, only anecdotes arranged with a flair for melodrama." "She's scared," I said. "You might call it superstition. I call it motivation, and motivation means she'll pay." That got him to pause mid-page. Lucinda looked at me gratefully, which didn't hurt my momentum. She might have had grief behind the veil, but her profile said money, and her coat said couture. "You said the ring's been appraised?" I asked her. She nodded. "At just under 140,000. Wolfe's nostrils flared like a man getting a whiff of expensive sherry. He marked his place in the book, but didn't close it. I pressed gently. "At the very least, it's an interesting object, with a body count." He said nothing, but he didn't dismiss her either. Lucinda laid the leather case on Wolfe's desk like it might bite. She flipped the latch with a slow, delicate motion. Inside, nestled on dark blue velvet, sat the mourner's eye. The pearl didn't glow. It absorbed light. Jet black with a faint green sheen, the thing looked like a drop of ink frozen in time. I leaned in for a better look and, I'll admit, felt a twitch behind the ears. I've seen diamonds that would bankrupt nations and rubies that looked like they bled. But this one had something different, like it was watching. Wolfe didn't touch it. He never did. But he stared at it a long moment. Lucinda spoke softly. "Every man who's worn that ring has died. I never wanted it. It came in a velvet envelope inside my father's will." Wolfe's brow crept up a fraction of an inch. He was intrigued, but he still hadn't said yes. Lucinda's voice dropped to a whisper, almost theatrical, but there was no mistaking the steel underneath. "I will be dead by Friday," she said. Unless you find out who's doing this. Or what, I muttered, because something about that pearl gave me the creeps. Wolfe opened his mouth, likely to deliver one of his classic "this is nonsense, leave my house" speeches, when the phone rang. Fritz answered from the hall. A few seconds later, he appeared with his face paler than his apron. "Sir, it's Miss Van Orton's residence. The butler. Dead. Just now." Lucinda gasped. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. I stood up straight. "What happened?" I asked. "Collapsed in the library," Fritz said. "They think it was sudden, possibly poison." Wolfe closed Herodotus with a deliberate snap. That was all the invitation the case needed. The room was heavy with the scent of orchids and Wolfe's disapproval. He had retreated to the plant room after Lucinda's departure, leaving me alone in the office to weigh the facts and her perfume. By dinner, I'd done enough weighing. Wolfe returned to his chair with the slow dignity of a man preparing to lecture a nation. "She's still downstairs," I said. He didn't answer, just adjusted the angle of a cut orchid and began scribbling notes like a botanist on trial. "Let's review," I said, propping myself on the desk corner. 3 men dead, a family fortune wrapped around a gem that looks like it could whisper in the dark, a client who looks like she walked out of a Gothic painting, and that pearl, appraised at roughly 140 grand. Wolfe turned a page. "She's terrified. She's rich. She's here." Still nothing. "Boss, either we take this case or I take her to dinner. At least one of us should be interested." He glanced at me, the corners of his mouth twitching in what for him counted as an outburst. "Mr. Goodwin," he said flatly, "you are incorrigible." It was Lucinda herself who tipped the balance, not with tears or pleading, but with a legal document. She returned to the office after Fritz brought up a tray of tea that no one drank. She reached into her handbag with the precision of a surgeon and withdrew a folded paper sealed in red wax. "This," she said, "is a notarized addendum to my will. It names Mr. Wolfe as beneficiary of the mourner's eye." Wolfe blinked. "If I'm killed," she added, "he inherits the ring, along with the curse." I let out a low whistle. Wolfe didn't. He took the paper, studied the seal, unfolded it with meticulous fingers. I watched his eyes flick over the contents like a detective flipping through alibis. Only this time, he was the alibi. "You made this change today?" he asked. "This morning," she replied, "before coming here." He nodded once and returned the will to its envelope. There was a pause, the kind that gathers weight between strangers and contracts. "That," Wolfe said at last, "is both presumptuous and tactically brilliant." He didn't say thank you, but he didn't leave the room either. Wolfe sank into his chair like a man preparing for a siege. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, fingertips gently tapping, as if a metronome were counting down to sarcasm. "Miss Van Orton," he began, "you understand, of course, that naming me heir to an object reputed to carry death is not a guarantee of my cooperation." Lucinda nodded. "I only want the truth, Mr. Wolfe." He opened his mouth, probably to unleash a fresh volley of disdain, but stopped. Her hand was trembling on the case again, ever so slightly. Not the theatrical kind, just a subtle shiver at the wrist. Wolfe narrowed his eyes. He looked at me. I gave him nothing but a shrug and an expression that said, "Told you so." He didn't reply, but he didn't dismiss her either. The Brownstones' telephone rang at precisely 7:03, which was unfortunate timing, since Fritz had just served Wolfe's trout. He scowled, folded his napkin like it had insulted him, and nodded to me. I answered. "Goodwin?" A clipped voice crackled on the other end. I listened for a moment, then straightened. "Who?" Wolfe asked from the table. "Lucinda's butler," I said, hanging up. "He's dead. Just collapsed in her library. No sign of violence." Lucinda gasped, one hand to her mouth. Her teacup rattled against the saucer. "Another one," she whispered. "Another man close to the pearl." Wolfe stood. That alone was newsworthy. "Details," he demanded. "Paramedics are on scene. No cause yet, but they said he was drinking tea at the time." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. His dinner sat untouched. "I presume," he said coolly, "that tea will be collected for analysis. If not, we'll insist." That was when I knew we were in. Wolfe didn't waste time on tea, unless it was poisoned. Later that evening, I found Wolfe in the office again, not reading for pleasure, but for preparation. He'd opened his massive file cabinet of poison reference texts and was thumbing through Bartholomew's compendium of non-alkaloidal toxins like it was the Sunday comics. I brought him a scotch. He didn't touch it. Instead, he glanced at me, then at the couch, which meant sit, speak, report. "She's sleeping in the guest room," I said. "Fritz triple-locked the back door and rigged the window with his grandma's alarm bell. We're secure." Wolfe nodded. "You've called Saul?" "Left a message. He'll check in before midnight." He closed the book gently, the same way he'd close a coffin lid. "This is no longer a matter of folklore," he said. "No," I agreed. "That was the third man. And all within the immediate orbit of a single object. Pfui." He stood and walked, actually walked, over to his desk, opened the center drawer, and pulled out a clean notepad. "Mr. Goodwin, fetch Mr. Panther. We are being baited." "Baited?" He met my eyes, and there was no trace of irony. "With elegance," he said. Then he sat, and the game, finally, began. The Van Orton mansion perched on the Upper East Side like a mausoleum with better upholstery. The kind of place where you expect the walls to have opinions and the staircases to groan in Latin. I arrived just after noon with instructions from Wolfe to observe with discretion and restraint. That was Wolfe-ese for don't flirt, don't crack jokes, and above all, don't touch the food. The front door was opened by a man with the expression of someone who'd just swallowed a bad idea and was being asked to do it again. He introduced himself as Merrick, the under-butler. Now, apparently, the acting chief of staff since the regular model had keeled over in the library. "Miss Van Orton is expecting you," he said, with the warmth of a granite fountain. The entry hall was cathedral high, panelled in walnut, and filled with enough shadow to start its own religion. My footsteps echoed like I was guilty of something, and the house didn't mind letting me know. We passed portraits of brooding men with medals and women whose jewelry looked like it might weigh more than their husbands. At the end of the corridor, a pair of double doors waited, shut tight. "She'll meet you in the study," Merrick said. "And Mr. Goodwin?" "Yeah?" "Try not to touch anything." The door opened on its own. This place had atmosphere in spades, and secrets hiding in the corners. Lucinda stood beside a mahogany display case that would have made a museum jealous. Her black dress was tailored, her eyes unreadable, and the pearl sat beneath the glass like a coiled viper waiting for a reason. "This is where I keep it now," she said. "Locked, watched." I approached slowly, like it might hiss. The mourner's eye rested in a deep blue velvet cradle, set in a platinum ring designed to hold it like a jewel or a hostage. It still had that unnatural gleam, the way wet obsidian reflects light without ever looking warm. It didn't sparkle. It absorbed. "How often do you check it?" I asked.
Every morning, every night, sometimes in between. Expecting it to vanish? She hesitated. Or reappear where it doesn't belong. That got my attention. She crossed her arms. There's something wrong with it, Mr. Goodwin. You can feel it. I could feel something. Whether it was the pearl or the pressure of 3 dead men, I wasn't sure yet. Outside the study window, wind stirred the ivy. Inside, the silence wrapped around us like velvet, suffocating and expensive. I'd just finished jotting notes on the room's layout, old Wolfe habit, when the door creaked and in walked a woman who didn't knock and didn't look like she'd ever had to. Evelyn Drexler had the bone structure of a fashion sketch and the attitude of a cocktail that had gone warm. Late 30s, maybe 40 with effort, dressed in burgundy silk and wearing a smirk that looked well rehearsed. You must be the detective, she said, eyeing me like I'd been pulled from under a couch. I must be, I replied, though the name's Goodwin. Lucinda's newest obsession, she added, not bothering to hide it. Does she think you'll save her from the ghost in the jewellery box? Lucinda's spine stiffened, but she said nothing. Evelyn floated closer to the display case, her eyes narrowing at the pearl. Ugly little thing, she said, like it crawled out of a sailor's nightmare. You believe the stories? I asked. I believe people die for less. Her gaze flicked to Lucinda, sharp enough to cut glass. Some people
attract tragedy the way others attract perfume counters. Nice to meet you too, I said. She gave me a brittle smile and swept out. Lucinda exhaled. She resents the will. Let me guess, I said. She was supposed to inherit? She expected to, until father changed it, because of things. Oh, I bet. The air in the room felt colder after Evelyn left. Dr. Milgrim was waiting for me in the sunroom, which felt like the only part of the house with any vitamin D. He was already seated, sipping something pale from a crystal glass. His handshake was firm but clammy, and he wore a tie that looked like it had been knotted by a philosophy professor on deadline. Mr. Goodwin, he said, smiling thinly, you're here about the eye. That's part of it, I said. The other part's about dead butlers. Ah, yes. Tragic. He didn't sound broken up. Dr. Milgrim had a voice like chamomile tea, smooth, calming, and possibly laced with something. He claimed to have been Lucinda's physician since childhood, though judging by the faint whiff of clove cigarettes and incense on his lapels, I suspected he also doubled as her spiritual advisor. Lucinda's experiencing the expected psychological effects, he said. Inherited trauma, guilt transference, symbolic fixation on the pearl. She thinks she's cursed? Milgrim nodded sagely. And so the mind manifests doom. Hysteria, hallucination, suggestion, fear becomes prophecy. Or maybe someone's using that fear to knock people off, I said. He gave me a look full of polite pity. You must be very logical, he said. That's rare these days. Thanks, I said. I keep it in the glove compartment. He chuckled lightly, but there was something behind his eyes that didn't laugh. As I left, he added, If she starts speaking to the pearl, let me know. I didn't answer. I was starting to wonder if the pearl was already speaking back. Simon Channing ran his boutique on Madison like a cardinal presiding over sacred objects. Tall, tanned, and so well-groomed he could have been lacquered, he ushered me into a private showroom with the air of a man preparing to unveil a holy relic. The mourner's eye, of course, had already made its appearance elsewhere, but Channing was happy to reminisce. Yes, I appraised it personally, he said, adjusting his silk cuffs with exaggerated care. Unusual luster, exceptional surface integrity, but it's the coloration that makes it priceless. Jet with a green flame, like an absinthe hallucination. Color's nice, I said, but people are dropping like champagne flutes around it. He gave me a thin smile. Yes, tragic. But you know how people are. They want mystery. A cursed object. How deliciously Victorian. You think it's nonsense? I think anything can be dangerous in the right or wrong hands. There was something slippery behind that grin, like he'd rehearsed every line with a mirror and a stopwatch. He leaned closer. Miss Van Orton should consider parting with it, for her own safety. That an offer? Consider it professional concern. I filed that under creeps with motive and shook his hand with the same caution I'd use for a snake. Henrietta Blair looked like she'd never met a ghost story she didn't believe. She was grey-haired, thin as chalk, and had the alertness of someone who still slept with a gas lamp and a pistol. She met me in the Van Orton library, floor-to-ceiling volumes, all leather-bound and radiating old money and older secrets. I've kept the family records since before Lucinda was born, she said, and I warned her. That pearl is a blood magnet. She didn't wait for my skepticism. Instead, she launched into a monologue that would have made Edgar Allan Poe sit up and take notes. 1720, she said, pulling a frayed ledger from a shelf. The mourner's eye belonged to a Dutch captain who stole it from a Javanese temple. His ship sank. Survivors were found mad, babbling about a black eye in the sea. She flipped another page. 1884. A great-aunt wore it at her wedding. Her groom vanished during their honeymoon cruise, never seen again. The pearl was found under her pillow. I leaned in. Ever think someone just wants that gem badly enough to kill for it? She sniffed. So did I once, until it started moving. Moving? I've locked it in that case myself, only to find it by the window the next morning. She stared at me with calm conviction. They say it brings ruin to every man who touches it. I smiled politely, but even I had to admit, her voice had a chill that lingered. The knock on the front door had the unmistakable rhythm of a man who didn't care what time it was, or who owned the building. Merrick opened it just fast enough to avoid being trampled. In walked Inspector Kramer, the human personification of a grudge, trench coat flapping and face set like poured concrete. "Goodwin," he grunted. "I figured I'd find you here." "I leave a trail of coffee and bad guesses," I said. "You just follow the breadcrumbs." He didn't smile. Kramer rarely did. But he did hold up a small evidence bag, dangling inside of which was something shriveled and dark brown. "Recognize this?" "A raisin's evil cousin. Peach Pit. Found it next to the body." He shoved it toward me. "The butler. Choked, according to the first doc. I don't buy it." "Neither does Wolfe," I said. "But he says it prettier." Kramer grunted again, his version of a handshake. "Where is His Majesty?" "Back at the brownstone." "Good. Keeps the air here breathable." He turned to bark at the nearest uniform. I watched the pit swinging in the bag. I'd seen enough poison cases to know it didn't have to be the pit that killed him. After Kramer thundered off to corner Lucinda, I wandered into the kitchen for a peek at the late butler's last cup of tea. The porcelain was still on the counter, handled with forensic tongs by someone who thought powdered gloves made them clever. I leaned close, nothing unusual, until I took a careful sniff. There it was, faint but unmistakable. Almond, not the bakery kind, the bitter, acrid kind that no sane person would swirl into Earl Grey. I'd smelled it before. At crime scenes, Wolfe had turned into lecture halls. Cyanide, classic, brutal, fast. I didn't say anything right away. I slipped back into the study and found Lucinda seated alone, staring at the pearl as if waiting for it to blink. "Miss Van Orton," I said gently, "do you know if your butler had any allergies?" "No," she replied, not turning. "He was careful, but not afraid." I nodded and made a mental note. Someone had just made things very real. Whoever they weren't finished. The mourner's eye wasn't cursed. It was hunted, and the list of hunters was growing teeth. Simon Channing's shop on Fifth Avenue was the kind of place where diamonds are sold by appointment and emeralds are displayed like visiting royalty. The walls gleamed, the air was perfumed with money, and the security cameras blinked like judgmental angels overhead. Channing himself was behind the glass counter, polishing a sapphire the size of a baby's fist with the reverence of a priest wiping down an altar. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, gliding toward me, "to what do I owe the pleasure and the implied accusation?" "Just checking in on your favorite cursed gem," I said. "The mourner's eye." He smiled, but his eyes flicked to the side, where a skinny kid in a black apron was rearranging cufflink trays with the nervous energy of someone juggling grenades. "We've already discussed the pearl," Channing said smoothly. "Its value, its uniqueness, its regrettable reputation. Regrettable's one word for it, fatal's another." He shrugged. "You know what they say. History adds zeros to the price tag." I glanced around the showroom. It sparkled with carefully arranged innocence. But beneath the glitter, there was something tight, a scent of tension. Channing's assistant kept looking toward the back room like he expected something to burst through it. "Business seems good," I said casually. "Always," Channing replied, too quickly. Maybe it was the reflection off the gems, but something in that room felt off, and something in the back was waiting to blow. I was just about to ask Channing if he'd like to revisit his statement, preferably under oath, when a dull pop echoed from the rear of the shop. A second later, a sharper crack followed, then a sound no jeweler ever wants to hear, shattering glass. And then came the fireball. It wasn't a cinematic eruption. No flames licking ceilings or chandeliers exploding in slow motion. Just a low whoosh, a flash of heat, and a plume of grey-black smoke that curled through the showroom like a snake on a schedule. "Call the fire department!" someone yelled. The assistant had disappeared through the back door moments before the noise. Channing, for all his silk and polish, turned the colour of old flour and staggered to the floor, clutching the edge of the nearest display like it might save him. I ran behind the counter and through the smoke, where the air was thicker and full of burnt copper. The back room was a wreck. Shelving twisted, the smell of scorched wiring, and in the corner, the kid. Crumpled like a forgotten marionette, his apron singed, eyes wide open but not blinking. I didn't need Wolfe's botanical nose to know he wasn't going to rearrange any more cufflinks. I backed out fast. There'd be sirens in minutes. Channing was hyperventilating, eyes darting. "Accident?" I asked. He didn't answer, but his silence was screaming. The cops arrived with enough force to make a rhinoceros retreat, led by a lieutenant who believed his badge gave him permission to bark. Within 20 minutes, the shop was roped off, the assistant's body was bagged, and Channing was being questioned in a tone that bordered on bedtime story. "Leaking gas line," one of the uniforms muttered to me. "Freak accident. Could have happened in any boiler room." "Except this one doesn't have a boiler," I said. He frowned. "What?" I pointed toward the scorched baseboard near the source of the fire. "Your leak was electrical. See that? Melted copper wire. Somebody bypassed a fuse. That wasn't a freak accident. That was sabotage." He gave me a look like I'd just insulted his mother. "Let the fire marshal handle it," he snapped. "Sure," I said. "Just make sure he knows how to spell murder." Channing sat slumped in a corner chair, pale as quartz, refusing water, refusing questions. But someone had wanted something in that room destroyed. And the assistant? He'd just been standing in the way. By the time I got back to the Van Orton mansion, the air had changed, and not just outside. Inside, the atmosphere was tighter, like the walls had stopped trusting the windows. Lucinda met me at the door in a robe, her face a blank slate scribbled with worry. "It's gone," she said, without hello. I didn't need to ask what. She led me to the study. The display case sat open, unshattered, and perfectly untouched. Except for the obvious. The mourner's eye had vanished. "Who had the key?" I asked. "Only me," she whispered. "And it wasn't forced. The lock's fine. It just wasn't locked." "You're sure you didn't leave it open?" Her expression flickered with something between guilt and fear. "No. I check it 3 times a day." The case was lined with blue velvet, as pristine as ever, not a fibre out of place. Was anyone in the room? No one. Merrick didn't even come in today. I was alone until just now. I circled the case. The window was latched. No prints, no smudges. "Where were you when it disappeared?" "In the bath." Convenient, or unlucky. Either way, the cursed pearl was gone, and someone had managed to take it without breaking a single thing, except possibly Lucinda's mind. The scream wasn't theatrical. It was low, ragged, and the kind that grabs you somewhere behind the ribs. I bolted back into the study, shoes skidding on the polished floor. Lucinda was crumpled on the rug, one hand clenched into a fist, and the other stretched toward the empty display case. Her face was pale as flour, lips moving without sound. It took a full 5 seconds before I made out the words. "She was here," she whispered. "In white. I saw her." Her hand opened. Inside it, crushed and damp with sweat, was a torn scrap of delicate lace. Old, yellowed, and frayed along one edge, like it had come from a garment that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. "Lucinda," I said, crouching beside her. "Who was she?" She blinked at me like I was speaking in Morse code. "She walked right through the wall." "Yeah, sure she did." I eased the lace from her grip and tucked it into my pocket. The air in the study was heavy now, not just with fear, but with something more intentional. Someone wanted her rattled, and they were doing a damn good job of it. The Van Orton mansion after midnight had all the charm of a mausoleum designed by paranoiacs. Hall sconces flickered like haunted lighthouses, and the east wing felt colder than the rest, probably just drafts, unless ghosts had learned to tinker with the thermostat. I had Fritz's mini flashlight in one hand and a .32 in my jacket pocket, just in case. I wasn't expecting company, just a quiet stroll past rooms full of lies. Then a voice behind me barked, "Hold it!" I spun and got a flashlight beam full in the eyes. The silhouette behind it was broad, square-jawed, and unmistakably irritated. "Well, well," I said. "If it isn't Manhattan's favorite bulldog." Inspector Kramer lowered the light. He looked like a man who'd just walked in on his own surprise party and hated every guest. "What the hell are you doing creeping through hallways, Goodwin?" "Admiring the architecture," I said, "and maybe chasing a clue." Kramer snorted. "Chasing shadows, more like it. You people are getting on my nerves." "You mean Wolfe?" "I mean you, him, and that cursed bauble circus you dragged me into." He leaned in. "I've got forensics on that butler's tea. You want to guess what they found?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He grunted. "Thought so." Then, squinting down the hall, "You hear anything weird tonight?" "Only a woman in white walking through walls." Kramer rolled his eyes. "Wonderful. Now the ghosts are in on it." By morning, the whole house felt like a shaken snow globe, except the snow was paranoia and half the figurines were dead. I returned to the brownstone with just enough sleep to be legally upright. Wolfe was already seated at his desk, fingers steepled, face a mask of disapproval carved by a sculptor with trust issues. "You've seen enough?" he asked. "I've seen too much. The eye is missing. Lucinda fainted cold, and Kramer's convinced we're breeding phantoms." He grunted. I handed him the scrap of lace and the note I'd found under the display case that morning, folded neatly and tucked beneath the velvet lining. Wolfe unfolded it with care. The eye must return to the sea. "Theatrical," he said, "but not illiterate." He rang for Fritz. "Stationery, fountain pens. I want handwriting samples from every guest and staff member with opposable thumbs." "You expecting a confession in cursive?" "No," Wolfe said, adjusting the note under his magnifier. "I expect contradictions, and those, Mr. Goodwin, are more telling than fingerprints." "Fair enough," I said, "though I still think the pearl's cursed." Wolfe gave me a look that could wither orchids. "If it is," he said, "then someone is profiting handsomely from folklore." Wolfe insisted we re-interview Channing at the brownstone, partly because he refused to step foot in a building recently scorched, and partly because he wanted the upper hand. That upper hand included a deep leather chair, a controlled temperature, and Fritz's biscuits, none of which Channing received. He arrived sleek as ever, in a charcoal suit and a pocket square sharp enough to draw blood. "I trust this is important," he said, easing into the red chair like it had been beneath him in a past life. "It may be fatal," Wolfe replied, "if your next answers are as evasive as your last." Archie's translation. Wolfe was in no mood. I brought out the Pearl's appraisal papers, slid them across the desk. Wolfe ignored them. "I want the story you didn't tell," he said. "The legend, the deaths." Channing's mouth curved. "Ah, the theatre of the gem." He laced his fingers. "They say the pearl was once worn by a Caribbean pirate queen, Isabella Giraud. She kept it sewn into her bodice, close to the heart, until her own crew mutinied and fed her to the sharks. The pearl survived. Her lovers did not." "Colourful," Wolfe said. "3 husbands dead, 2 jewellers, 1 collector who slit his wrists in a Viennese hotel." "And yet," I said, "you wanted to buy it?" Channing met my eyes with a smile that didn't reach his. "Danger adds value." Wolfe's voice was a knife. "So does proximity to murder." Channing didn't flinch, but he stopped smiling. Wolfe didn't like doctors in general. He tolerated surgeons, dismissed general practitioners, and reserved special scorn for those in the mind sciences, which meant Dr. Milgrim was walking into enemy territory the moment he stepped into the office. Milgrim arrived with a calm so carefully arranged it made me itch. He wore a dark tweed jacket, 2 shades too philosophical, and carried a leather-bound notebook like it held the secrets of the universe, or at least a few mild sedatives. "I understand Miss Van Orton has suffered another episode," he began. "She collapsed," I said, "after seeing a woman in white and clutching antique lace. Either she's being haunted, or someone's staging a Victorian melodrama." Milgrim gave a sage nod. "Hysteria is often dramatized subconsciously." Wolfe grunted. "Hysteria is often diagnosed lazily." Milgrim smiled, unfazed. "You reject the mind-body connection?" "I reject speculation dressed in the robes of science," Wolfe said. "Do proceed." Milgrim leaned forward, hands steepled like a man selling enlightenment. "Lucinda is under immense pressure. She believes she is cursed, and the human mind, particularly one shaped by grief and trauma, can manifest perceived realities." "She imagined a killer?" I asked. "She imagined a context," he replied. "The killer may be real, but the power she gives the pearl, that is her own." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Convenient, Doctor. A theory that validates both murder and mysticism." Milgrim merely nodded again. "You're free to mock," he said, "but fear kills." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured, "and sometimes so do men in tweed." I was back at the Van Orton place the next morning, checking on Lucinda, who had finally slept for more than 10 minutes without waking up in a cold sweat. The staff, what was left of it, kept glancing over their shoulders like they expected to see ghosts with time cards. That's when Merrick came to me, pale and stiff. "Miss Drexler isn't in her room," he said. "Sleeping elsewhere?" "No, sir. Her bed hasn't been touched, and the side door is unlocked." I didn't need a séance to know something was off. I marched up to Evelyn's room and found it looking like a robbery had crashed a divorce. Drawers yanked open, a suitcase half packed, half spilled across the floor, jewelry boxes overturned, one empty, one crushed. But the real find was on the writing desk, what was left of a torn page, the ink smeared from what might have been water or panic. "Forgive me, Lucinda." That was all it said, and even that much looked like it had been written in haste, or guilt, or both. I took the page, careful not to add my own fingerprints, and called Wolfe. "She ran," I told him, "left the room in a mess, and the back door wide." "She left a note?" "Half of one. Might have meant to say more." Wolfe paused. "Or less." I checked the closet. Her coats were gone. Her makeup tray left behind. "Think she's guilty?" "Guilt and fear often share a mask," Wolfe said. "Find the mask maker. If Saul Panzer ever takes up sculpture, it'll be because Granite asked him for lessons. He showed up at the brownstone that evening with his tie loose, his coat damp, and a gleam in his eye that meant results. Wolfe, of course, hadn't moved since lunch. "Well?" he asked, without looking up from the day's newspaper. Saul sat and folded his hands. "I found your ghost's chemist." That got Wolfe's attention. "Name? Edward Percy, Midtown compounder, real old school. Still hand labels his apothecary bottles and wears gloves like he's afraid of leaving fingerprints in the ether." Wolfe grunted. "And?" "He confirmed someone bought potassium cyanide from him 3 weeks ago. Small dose. Claimed it was for pest control." "Who?" Saul smiled faintly. "A woman, blonde, glasses, gave the name Henrietta Blair." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Lucinda's family archivist?" "The same. Though here's the kicker. She signed the purchase log not as herself, but as Montague." Wolfe's brow arched. I chimed in. "Montague? Wasn't that the name of her—" "Dead Pomeranian," Saul said. "Buried last spring. Real ugly mutt, according to Merrick." "I remember," I said. "It used to bite people's ankles like it was solving a crime." Wolfe stood. That alone meant Saul's intel had landed. "So, Miss Blair poisons a servant, then stages hauntings?" I asked. "Or," Wolfe said, "someone frames her by resurrecting her dog." He looked at the note again. The eye must return to the sea. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "this is no longer theatrical. It is deliberate." He turned toward his orchids. "And deliberate minds," he added, "leave fingerprints, even if signed with a paw print." When Wolfe disappeared into the orchid room, it was usually to avoid human beings, not contemplate them. But this time, he didn't take a book or a glass of beer. He just went. That meant he was either angry, worried, or, worse, thinking. I gave him 20 minutes before I cracked and wandered upstairs. The heat in the orchid room could have cooked a duck, but Wolfe stood in the middle of it all like a sun-baked philosopher. His back was to me, his hand adjusting the mist level on a delicate hybrid he claimed was rarer than decency. "Why lace?" he said. I blinked. "Sorry?" "The scrap Miss Van Orton held. Lace. It's archaic, specific, feminine. It evokes memory, not menace. I stayed quiet. That, he continued, is not a random act. It's symbolism, Mr. Goodwin, and symbolism is choice. He turned. I want you to call Saul. Get lists. Lists? Every suspect's known aliases, false IDs, pen names, theatre credits, whatever they've used. And the last 3 items each purchased in Manhattan, goods or services. I want receipts, delivery slips, gossip. That'll take time. He waved a hand. So will murder, but it's working faster. He didn't wait for my response. Back downstairs, I dialed Saul with the uneasy sense that the case was no longer about a pearl. It was about a performance. And someone had written a part for death. Back at the Van Orton mansion, I was doing what any good operative would, playing amateur therapist to a client with eyes like midnight and enough emotional baggage to fill Grand Central. Lucinda had returned to her usual self, or at least the version that walked, talked, and didn't scream about women in white. We were in the solarium. I was on the couch, and she was talking about her father's will, the way he'd changed it 6 months before his death, and how Evelyn had taken it as a personal crucifixion. I don't think she killed anyone, Lucinda said softly. I shrugged. Maybe not. But if she ran, she's hiding from something. There was a moment of quiet. She looked out the window, eyes clouded. I never wanted the pearl, she murmured. I wanted him. I wanted... She stopped. Your fiancé? She nodded, and then turned toward me. And I'll admit, it wasn't the worst moment of my day. That's when Fritz rang the bell. He stood in the doorway, holding a small black velvet box like it might explode. Mr. Goodwin, he said, this arrived by courier. No return address. I opened it. Inside, nestled against crushed satin, was a pigeon's claw. Clutched in its stiff, curled talons was a black bead, round, glassy, and unmistakably designed to mimic the mourner's eye. Lucinda gasped. I didn't blame her. Underneath the claw was a card. No message, just a printed date. Friday. Today was Wednesday. Looks like someone's sending invitations, I said, but I wasn't sure if the guest of honor was expected to show up or drop dead. Wolfe did not appreciate being summoned from his orchids to examine poultry appendages, but Fritz's tone had carried just enough dread to make it happen. He took one look at the velvet box, the claw, and the glass bead, and sat, slowly, like someone resigning from rationality. Archie, he said, describe it. A pigeon's foot, stiff and snipped, clutching what looks like a mock black pearl, delivered by courier. No return address, no note, just a card with a date. Friday. Yes. Wolfe exhaled through his nose. This is no longer theatre. I raised a brow. It's not. No. Theatre requires an audience. This is stagecraft without applause, ritual without artifice. It is meant for one person only, Miss Van Orton. Lucinda sat curled in the corner chair, hands clenched in her lap. They want her undone, Wolfe said. Not killed, not yet. They want her broken, hysterical, discredited. She's halfway there, I muttered. Wolfe shot me a look. Deliberate fear, Mr. Goodwin, is a more precise instrument than poison. It isolates, it distracts, and it ensures that when the final act comes, no one sees the sleight of hand. He turned to the box. Note the claw, ritualistic, the simulacrum pearl, a motif. Which means we are dealing not with legend, he said coldly, but with a mind, structured, intelligent, possibly pathological. He leaned back, folded his arms. Find me that courier, Mr. Goodwin, and tell Saul to widen the net. I want everyone who ever touched the mourner's eye, directly or by desire. He paused. This is no longer about inheritance. What is it about? Control, Wolfe said, and someone is beginning to lose theirs. There are days when Nero Wolfe's office resembles a courtroom, a library, or a sauna, depending on the season and the heat of his temper. That day, it became a stage. At precisely 4 o'clock, the parade began. One by one, the dramatis personae of our cursed little melodrama were ushered into Wolfe's sanctum and arranged like chessmen. Lucinda took the red armchair, pale and twitchy. Simon Channing hovered near the window, all pressed linen and colonial charm. Dr. Milgrim leaned stiffly against the bookcase, eyes darting like a man trying to remember what lie he told last. Henrietta Blair sat upright on the settee, spine straighter than a piano wire. And Mrs. Drexler, summoned from wherever she'd fled, perched near the Globe bar like a cat back from exile. Me? I stood beside that Globe bar with my notepad and my best poker face, watching them all like a croupier in a room full of desperate gamblers. Fritz had laid out coffee service like we were hosting a peace summit, but no one touched a drop. Wolfe didn't speak right away. He sat, motionless, the tips of his fingers meeting like twin mountaintops. The silence stretched so tight you could have bounced a dime off it. Then he finally said, "This is a performance, but not mine." That was the overture. Act 1 was about to begin. "I have no taste," Wolfe declared, "for superstition, nonsense, or the theatrical perversions of grief." If that didn't warm the room, nothing would. Channing gave a scoff. Milgrim adjusted his tie. Lucinda blinked twice in rapid succession. Wolfe continued without mercy. "This pearl, this so-called mourner's eye, has been imbued with the drama of a Greek tragedy and the logic of a carnival fortune-teller. Pirate queens, murdered husbands, ghostly women in white. Piffle." Henrietta opened her mouth. Wolfe raised a finger. "I have tolerated these tales only to see where they lead, and they have led, predictably, to disruption, cowardice, and, yes, violence." He shifted in his chair. "But the matter is no longer amusing." "Tell that to the dead pigeon," I said. Wolfe ignored me. "I will now, if permitted, replace fable with fact. I will not entertain outbursts, accusations, or diversions. You are here to listen. If you choose not to, there is the door." No one moved. Even Mrs. Drexler stayed seated, though her expression could have boiled water. "Good. Then let us proceed." He leaned forward, and the room collectively held its breath. "There is method behind the madness," Wolfe said, "but the madness was designed." And suddenly, no one was looking at the pearl. They were all looking at each other. "You have all," Wolfe said, "been played." That got a reaction. Henrietta stiffened, Channing frowned, and Milgrim looked about ready to file a malpractice claim. "Fear," Wolfe continued, "is as potent a weapon as poison, more so perhaps because it leaves no trace on a post-mortem. It infiltrates, it disrupts, it paralyzes." He pointed toward Lucinda, who sat silent, her fingers white-knuckled on the armrest. Miss Van Orton was the intended target, not of murder, but of ruin. Her credibility, her sanity, her inheritance. Lucinda blinked rapidly, but stayed quiet. "Now," Wolfe said, "let us consider the choreography. 1. The tale of the mourner's eye, seeded through family gossip and embellished through private conversation. Whoever knew of the myth ensured it would echo louder when events began to imitate it. 2. A woman in white. Whether hallucination or staged performance, it appears only to Lucinda. A touch of white lace at each scene. Theatrics, calculated to disorient. 3. A pigeon's claw, mailed in velvet. Symbolic, visceral, not just a threat. An act of psychological invasion. Wolfe's eyes swept the room. These events are not connected by accident. They are linked by intention. And the purpose? Channing asked, voice tight. Wolfe turned his gaze on him. To conceal a theft and disguise a manipulation of the estate. Milgrim leaned forward. So you're saying the killer isn't superstitious? I am saying, Wolfe said, that the killer is a puppeteer, and each of you danced. The silence was dense. Fear, Wolfe said again softly, is most effective when it wears a familiar mask. The mourner's eye, Wolfe said, is gone. I looked up from my notebook. That was news, even to me. Gone? Henrietta asked. But Lucinda wore it to the funeral. Indeed. Wolfe nodded. A convincing replica. Glass, perhaps obsidian, swapped weeks ago. Lucinda's face went slack. But the safe. Yes, the safe, Wolfe echoed. Replaced after the original was removed, and when the legend took over, no one dared to question the authenticity. Who would touch a cursed gem? Who would examine it? He looked at Channing. Except the one who had already removed it, and now watched others fear it. But the box was locked, Lucinda began. Lockable boxes, Wolfe said dryly, are conveniences, not fortresses. I dare say Mr. Goodwin could demonstrate their fallibility with a hairpin and a passing mood. I gave a small bow. The real pearl is long gone, Wolfe continued, and in its place an elaborate story of doom and vengeance calculated to delay scrutiny until the estate passed hands. But to whom? Mrs. Drexler asked, brow arched. That, Wolfe said, is where motive sharpens. He shifted, his voice cool, and that is what we will now uncover. The room pulsed with unease. Someone in that room had traded truth for theatrics, and Wolfe was about to drag them back to the spotlight. Wolfe's gaze passed over the suspects like a cat surveying a row of goldfish. There is a pattern here, he declared, but only if one bothers to see it. No one dared interrupt, though Channing's jaw tensed like he was chewing broken glass. Wolfe spoke with a deliberate, unhurried cadence. The fiancé, Jonathan Rusk, drowned 3 days after gifting the pearl. A boating accident. The current was blamed, but his shoes were found on the dock, dry as bone. Milgrim cleared his throat, then thought better of it. Wolfe continued. Then the butler, Mr. Thomas Hatch. He was nosy, had served the Van Ortons 22 years, and knew where every box, paperclip and secret was tucked. He dies mysteriously from tainted port, a rare toxin, conveniently masked by age. Now, Simon Channing's assistant, blown to bits in a gas leak no one expected, in a building wired by professionals. Piped in. That's 3 men who got close enough to ask questions and got answers in the morgue. Wolfe didn't nod. He never nodded. But he did lean forward an inch, which for him is practically tap dancing. You may call them accidents, he said, but I call them eliminations. Henrietta gripped her purse tighter. Milgrim looked out the window. Only Lucinda dared whisper, all because of the pearl. No, Wolfe said, because of the truth behind it. That landed like a pistol shot in a quiet room. I have here, I said, unfolding a sheet like it might bite, a letter, or most of one. Lucinda leaned forward, eyes rimmed red. Wolfe gave me a nod, so I cleared my throat and read. You mustn't believe the story about the eye. It was never cursed, only cursed by what people do for it. Jonathan. I paused. He didn't. I swear he didn't. It was an accident. But now they're coming for me too. I tried to warn. The bottom half was torn, the ink smudged like it had soaked up a whole ocean of regret. Wolfe spoke softly for once. Miss Evelyn Van Orton attempted a confession, not of guilt, but of anguish. She vanished, Mrs. Drexler said. She fled. No, Wolfe replied. She panicked. Fear, as we've seen, is a precise tool. He looked at Lucinda. She tried to protect you. And then she vanished, likely driven out, not by malice, but by grief. Lucinda's chin trembled, but she said nothing. Guilt can masquerade as guiltiness, Wolfe said, but her crime was feeling too much. And in the long hush that followed, even the ticking of the Seth Thomas clock felt accusatory. Wolfe turned his head slowly. Dr. Milgrim. The good doctor stiffened like someone had pressed a stethoscope to his conscience. Wolfe went on, his voice as cold as Fritz's marble pastry slab. You, sir, diagnosed death with remarkable consistency, provided the cause suited the narrative. Milgrim scowled. Are you accusing me of malpractice? No, Wolfe said. I am accusing you of murder. If that didn't clear the room of air, nothing would. I took one step forward just in case Milgrim lunged. He didn't. He just blinked, then muttered, You're insane. Wolfe's tone remained clinical. You obscured truth beneath suggestion. You employed barbiturates in small doses, administered via brandy or port, enough to produce confusion, hallucination, visions of women in white, perhaps. Lucinda gasped softly. You let legend do the heavy lifting, Wolfe continued. The mind sees what it fears. Channing looked stricken. You mean she didn't? Lucinda never. No, Wolfe snapped. She didn't. He rose. Yes, rose, which happens about as often as Halley's Comet. You use death like a conductor uses a baton, Doctor. Subtle flourishes, precise timing. But the melody, that was manipulation. Milgrim's lips parted, but no sound came out. Wolfe settled back down, breathing heavily, hands back on the armrests. You buried your crime beneath drama, he said, and now we shall exhume it. The knock came as if scripted. I opened the front door, and in slipped Saul Panzer, silent as a librarian at a wake, trench coat buttoned and eyes sharper than a broken promise. He walked straight to Wolfe, handed him a small velvet pouch and said, Locker 117 at Grand Central, rented 2 weeks ago under the name Martin Feld. That name's as real as a $3 bill. Wolfe took the pouch and opened it with the care of a man unwrapping an orchid. Inside gleamed a pearl, not just any pearl, the mourner's eye in all its cold, unholy lustre. Miss Blair, Wolfe said, holding it up to the light, you may recognize this. Henrietta recoiled. I thought it was destroyed. No, Wolfe said, merely hidden, but not by Evelyn, and not by Lucinda. He turned his gaze on Dr. Milgrim, whose silence had become sweat. You kept it as insurance, Wolfe said, a safety net, should the myth lose traction. Milgrim stared at the pearl like it might leap up and bite him. It was never about the curse, I said. It was about control. Wolfe nodded once. One pearl, one locker, one truth you could no longer bury. I turned to Saul. How'd you find it? Saul smirked. I asked the right questions and wore gloves. Wolfe placed the pearl gently on the desk. The case, he said, has finally regained its clarity. And just like that, the eye stopped mourning. The front door slammed open like an unpaid tab, and in stormed Inspector Kramer, hat askew, cigar clenched, and temper pre-lit. He surveyed the room, eyes narrowing as they landed on Milgrim. So, he growled, the sawbones is the snake. Wolfe inclined his head half an inch. Indeed. Kramer motioned to the uniform behind him. Cuff him. Milgrim didn't resist. His hands went out like a man surrendering to gravity, but he didn't say a word. Not to Kramer, not to Wolfe, not even to me, though I offered my most charming grin. You're making a mistake, Henrietta Blair said sharply. He's a respected lady, Kramer snapped. He's a respected fraud who mixed murder with mythology. The cuffs clicked shut, like punctuation marks on a confession Wolfe didn't need to hear aloud. Wolfe watched from his chair, expression unreadable. But I knew that look. It was the same one he gave a fungus that had the audacity to wilt. A man of intelligence, Wolfe murmured, wasted on theatrics and poison. What a vulgar economy. As they led Milgrim away, Saul gave me a small nod and disappeared the way he came, quiet, clean, efficient. Kramer lingered just long enough to mutter, "Still got no badge, Wolfe." Wolfe sipped his beer and replied, "Neither do I have foolish prejudices, Inspector." That was Wolfe's version of a parting shot, and judging by Kramer's scowl, it hit dead center. When the door clicked shut behind Kramer, Lucinda rose slowly from the couch. Her face looked like it had been through a wind tunnel of emotion, fear, grief, disbelief, and now something almost worse, relief. She crossed to Wolfe, hands clasped tight, voice unsteady but full. "Mr. Wolfe, I don't know how to thank you." "You needn't," he replied, eyes half-lidded. "You've already repaid me by surviving." She blinked, clearly not expecting that flavor of tenderness. Wolfe followed it immediately with the verbal equivalent of mothballs. Tacitus wrote, "It is human nature to hate the man whom you have hurt. Beware of misplaced gratitude. It sours." Lucinda gave a dry laugh. "You really don't make this easy, do you?" "No," Wolfe said. "Nor do I cater to theatrics." I stepped in to lighten the mood. "He's like that with everyone. You should have seen him when I once brought him a slice of rhubarb pie on the wrong plate." "That was deliberate sabotage," Wolfe intoned, not looking at me. Lucinda glanced between us, lips twitching, then exhaled. "Still, I hope you'll allow me to send a token of thanks. Flowers, perhaps?" Wolfe's eye twitched. "If you must, make it edible." She smiled again, this time warmer. "I'll remember that." He stood, which is never a casual act, and turned toward the dining room. "Now, if you'll excuse me," he said, "I have squab in red wine sauce awaiting decency." And with that, he vanished. Lucinda turned to me. "He really is one of a kind." "Worse," I said. "He knows it." I found her in the alley behind the brownstone, standing by the garbage bins, arms folded like armor. Evelyn Van Orton looked like someone who had read her own obituary and didn't agree with the tone. "I figured you'd come back the sneaky way," I said. "You always had a flair for second entrances." She gave a wan smile. "Is Lucinda angry?" "She's making tea and wiping her eyes with the good napkins. Take that how you like." Evelyn nodded. "I didn't know where else to go." "Try the front door next time," I said, stepping aside. "It creaks less than your conscience." She followed me inside, coat clutched like a shield. When Lucinda saw her, there were no shrieks, no slaps, no dramatic violin, just a deep, breathless moment. Then Lucinda crossed the room and hugged her like someone pulling a sibling out of a dream. "I thought you were gone forever," Lucinda whispered. "I almost was," Evelyn said. Wolfe did not emerge. He'd done his duty, and emotions were not on his menu. Lucinda pulled away, eyes bright. "Promise me no more pearls, no more curses." "No more anything," Evelyn replied. Just truth." I stayed back, watching them. A reunion with no applause, just the sound of two women choosing honesty over fear. And for once, the brownstone felt like it could breathe. I checked my watch. Still time for Fritz's Tuesday trout. And yes, curse or no curse, I planned to survive it. The front door hadn't even cooled from Evelyn's return when the bell rang again. One sharp, two longs. Kramer's personal signature, like a fat thumbprint on a white collar. I let him in, and he stomped across the rug like it had insulted his lineage. "You had it all, didn't you?" he barked. "Sat on it like a rooster on a gold egg." I shrugged. Wolf's eggs don't hatch until the water's just the right temperature. You know that. Kramer snorted, then spotted Wolfe in the office, already reclining with his beer and a smugness thick enough to slice. "I ought to lock you up for obstruction." "You oughtn't," Wolfe replied without looking up. "But your impulse toward ritualistic complaint is noted." Kramer grunted. That quack had enough arsenic in his props to poison a banquet. Wolfe inclined his head slightly. He needed only a shadow of fear. The rest was chemical embellishment. Kramer scratched his jaw. "And the pearl?" "In a locker under a false name," I offered helpfully. "And not real. Just expensive enough to get a man drowned and another blown up." The inspector growled low, like a dog that knows it's lost the bone. Then, as always, came the traditional send-off. "You still got no badge?" Wolfe turned to him, calm as a sleeping volcano. "And you," he said crisply, "still have no poetry?" Kramer made a noise that could have curdled cream, then turned on his heel and slammed the door like a punctuation mark. I watched Kramer retreat down the stoop, shaking his head like he'd lost a poker hand to a cat. Then I leaned on the desk and eyed Wolfe, who was pretending not to enjoy himself. "You know," I said, "you've got to admit, that pearl's got a body count." Wolfe harumphed. "A trinket. An object imbued with false value and undeserved mystery. The human brain is a most unreliable witness when besotted with myth." I grinned. "Sure. And women fall for it every time." "Women," Wolfe declared, "fall for illusions, as men fall for certainty. Both errors are fatal." "Put that on a valentine," I said. He didn't smile, but I caught the edge of amusement in the way he tapped the side of his glass. From the kitchen, I could smell Fritz working his magic. Trout with brown butter and almonds. Not my favorite, but miles ahead of death by pearl. I walked over to the side table where Saul had left the fake gem. It looked innocent enough now, just a shiny lump that had stirred up superstition, murder, and more family drama than a Broadway melodrama. I slipped it into a drawer with a sigh. Remind me never to propose with anything that's not made of glass. "You'll find," Wolfe said behind me, "that most romantic pledges, like cursed jewels, are counterfeits that glitter." "And you say I'm the cynic?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense. You're merely verbose." Well, he had me there. Dinner, as always, arrived at the stroke of 8. Fritz, wearing the solemn expression of a man delivering news of great consequence, unveiled the squab in red wine sauce with pearl onions and roasted root vegetables. No symbolism intended, but the onions did resemble small white marbles, which didn't go unnoticed by yours truly. Wolfe took his first bite, closed his eyes, and emitted a small noise, the closest thing he gives to applause. Fritz beamed. "There is a divine silence in restraint," Wolfe murmured. "Meaning?" I asked, lifting a fork. "Meaning you are not yet ruining this meal with conversation." I obliged for about 4 seconds. When dessert arrived, poached pears with anise and clove, Wolfe finally deigned to speak. "This entire affair," he said between measured bites, "was not about superstition. It was about manipulation. Superstition merely served as its vehicle. "So what now?" I asked. "You write an essay for the Journal of Psychosomatic Murder?" He gave me a regal glance. "Now, I return to my orchids." And he did, retreating upstairs like a monk ascending to prayer. I trailed after with my coffee, not because I like plants, but because I had a hunch. Sure enough, there it was, tucked near the base of his rare Paphiopedilum mordiae, glittering under the grow lights, the fake black pearl. I said nothing, because sometimes the smartest thing a man can do is pretend he doesn't notice the treasure in plain sight. In the end, the curse that haunted the mourner's eye was never in the pearl itself, but in the fears and failings of those who surrounded it. Greed wore a cloak of myth, and love twisted in the shadows until it broke. Wolfe, as ever, untangled the threads with disdain for superstition, and left behind a room cleared of smoke, but not without a lingering silence. Do you believe fear can be more dangerous than intent, or are they simply two sides of the same crime? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.